Hello, everyone. We are right at the top of the hour. And if you've just joined us or if you're joining us, welcome. And we're happy to have you here. So, we're having a very exciting conversation today, and we are joined by very experienced facilitators who will speak to us about the topic under discussion. So, before we do that, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Bridget Ndlovu, and I work with Paradigm Initiative as Partnerships and Engagements Officer. Paradigm Initiative is part of the 10 member organizations under the African Internet Rights Alliance. This conversation today is being conducted and led by the AIRA network. And speakers that are on this call are also part of the AIRA network. So if you've not engaged with our work as the network, this is a great time for you to engage with us and find out more about the organizations that are part of the AIRA network. So a good starting point for now would be to invite Adiboro Odunlami to speak to us and welcome us to this conversation today. Over to you, Adiboro.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bridget, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a quick welcome and to introduce, Bridget has already done a great job, but to introduce the African Internet Rights Alliance. As she said, we are an alliance of 10 civil society organizations, research institutions that work on digital rights and internet freedoms in Africa. And our vision is really simple, really big. We want an Africa where digital rights are upheld in all aspects of life, governance, and the economy. And we do so by engaging both internally and externally. And AIRA Talks is one of those opportunities, a platform for policymakers, civil society leaders, representatives of various organizations, and any individual who's really interested in advancing digital rights to come together, regularly convene, we share experiences and gleanings and learnings from our different works. And we hope that with the things that we discuss and the ideas that we share, we can spur you to take action or to do work differently and eventually to achieve the vision that we have for the continent. Welcome to today's AIRA Talks. We have a fantastic lineup of panelists, and I look forward as well to learning. Thank you once again. We want this to be very interactive, so please have questions, write them down, drop them in the chat, and ask them when the opportunity arises. Thank you once again, Bridget, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Adiboro, for that introduction of the AIRA network. And at this point, I would like to invite our panelists to share their work and also highlight what their mission is. So I'll start off with Victor Ndende, who is part of Amnesty International. And then after Victor, we will have Bridget Andere, and then Nompilo Simanje, as well as Ashna Kalemera. So over to you, Victor, in that order. Please do introduce yourself. Tell us more about your work, of course, in brief. Tell us more about your work and why this conversation is important for you.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and apologies. I may have a bit of a challenge with the internet. I'm in the middle of a travel. My name is Victor Ndede. I work for Amnesty International in Kenya. I'm currently the head of programs, but also looking after our work on technology and human rights, which essentially is looking at the intersection of technology and human rights, and how, of course, technology is affecting either the experience of human rights or actually the violation of human rights. But more broadly, we are a human rights organization founded in, I think, 1962. So we've been here for many years, fighting bad guys, advancing and advocating for human rights across the world in all spheres of rights, looking at civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and now, of course, more pertinent, technology and human rights. And I think, of course, this topic is very important in terms of how much we're experiencing our digital rights, and repression online is definitely a reflection of the repression in the offline space, and definitely looking to have this discussion on digital authoritarianism and how it's escalating on the African continent, and its impacts and effects on democracy or democratic values and human rights. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Victor, and over to the next person, and in that order.
Thank you, Bridget. My name is Bridget Andere. So it's very interesting to say thank you, Bridget, and say my name is Bridget. I work with Access Now as a senior policy analyst, and I am based in Nairobi. Access Now is a human rights organization that works in a grassroots to global model to defend and extend the rights of people at risk. And we also have ECOSOC status with the UN. And basically, our work uses a model that employs advocacy and policy. We also have a helpline within Access Now that works to help human rights defenders in need. And it's a 24/7 helpline if you ever need help. We also have a grants program where we support grassroots organizations who do work that aligns with our priorities. And beyond that, we do a lot of work just to engage with governments and other civil society organizations to ensure that people's rights are protected online and off. We have a number of programs running. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about them, but it's a very timely conversation, this one about authoritarianism, especially in the last year, as we've seen what is happening on the continent. And we hope to be able to come to a place where we can find new ways to work together to combat some of the issues that we're seeing arise on the continent and governments that are proponents of authoritarianism. Over to you, Ashna.
Thank you, Bridget. You've skipped the queue. It should have been Nampilo, but I'm happy to go next. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. First, thank you to AIRA for convening this very timely space to discuss issues around authoritarianism, control mechanisms, and strategy for pushback. My name is Ashna Kalimera. I work as the program's head at CIPESA. CIPESA is the Collaboration on International ICT Policy for East and Southern Africa. We are based in Kampala, Uganda, where it's 29 degrees at the moment. So in case I look flustered, you know it's because I'm sweating. But we work across the African continent with a focus on tech policy, but also tech practice as it intersects with governance, as it intersects with social justice, as it intersects with socio-economic development. Across that very big basket, we look at issues such as digital rights, digital democracy, the digital economy, digital resilience, innovation, and a whole host of other issues. We are most famous for the Forum on Internet Freedom in Africa, which we host every year in September. But we're also famous for a few other things like the Africa Digital Rights Fund, through which we subgrant to organizations to have grassroots actors, new and emerging initiatives be part of this movement that's advancing the role of tech on the African continent. A pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashna. I take it I can jump in now. Glad to be part of the conversation. And thank you so much to the AIRA network for organizing, this important conversation. So my name is Nompilo Smanje, and I work with the International Press Institute, a global organization. Victor, unfortunately, we founded quite earlier than you in 1950. We recently celebrated our 75th anniversary, so we are quite pumped up about that. But yeah, we're a global network of journalists, editors, and publishers who share a common dedication to quality and independent journalism. And together we promote the conditions that allow the media to operate free from interference and without fear. So basically our mission is to defend media freedom and the free flow of news and information wherever they're being threatened, which unfortunately so many countries across the globe and in Africa included. So I work as the Africa Advocacy and Engagement Lead. And through our Africa work, we do monitoring and documentation of president threats and violations, both online and offline. And that work is the anchor also, which informs our evidence-based advocacy. Yeah, we've been seeing so many trends, which make this conversation quite important also because the media has been taking up the digital space. to tap into new audiences, to tap into new platforms for news dissemination. So you'd find that digital repression has also impacted the media and the realization of media freedom quite significantly also in the recent years. So this is quite an important conversation, and I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you. And I believe I was the last one, or did I leave out someone?
Thanks a lot, Nompilo. Thanks a lot to all the facilitators who were able to share about their work. If you've just joined us once again, we are the AIRA network, a collaboration of 10 civil society organizations that are working to promote digital rights and inclusion across the African continent. And if you're joining us today, I'm definitely certain that you already know that our topic is focusing on digital authoritarianism within the African continent, the escalation of state repression, and the erosion of democratic thresholds. But before we go into the digital authoritarianism aspect, I would like to pose a question to all of the facilitators. Is there digital authoritarianism? And as you respond to that, I would like you to tell us if there is a rise or there is a decrease. So please do enlighten us. At this point, I would like to hand over to Victor to start us off with the conversation of whether or not there is digital authoritarianism in Africa. And then, of course, please do respond to whether there is a rise or a decrease. So over to you, Victor.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and I'll just request you if you can let me know if my network drops. I keep getting a low bandwidth error. As I pointed out earlier, I'm in the middle of a travel, so if it breaks, just let me know, and I'll be happy to repeat. But just to dive onto it, sorry, let me just do it with the camera, I think. Yeah, so just to dive onto it, yes, there is, I think the short answer to that question is yes, there is digital authoritarianism on the continent. We are not just, of course, seeing a rise in digital authoritarianism. We are actually seeing an escalation of digital authoritarianism, and in the sense that, like previously what we saw was, it used to be an occasional thing, happens once in a while, particular countries, and often around very specific periods of time, mostly the electoral cycle. But what we have come to see now, it's become like sort of a standard operating procedure for many governments, that they basically clamp down the digital space in any instance of a public order incident, be it an election, be it a public health emergency, be it anything. What looks to be the standard operating procedure for many governments is clamping down the digital space. And so this escalation has gone beyond what we just thought was the usual clampdown, but it has also gotten a bit more what you'd call complex or sophisticated, for that matter, in the sense that the first thing we are seeing is it's being normalized. It's now we are now getting to a point where it will actually be the absurdity, if I would put it that way, if in an electoral cycle we don't see or we don't have an internet shutdown, because now it's becoming normalized that if there's an election, we anticipate a shutdown. And I'm sure the other Bridget on the call from Access now would have figures, of course, on what the internet shutdowns look like on the continent. I haven't refreshed as much on that, but I think it should be around 20 or something internet shutdowns on the continent. And that was, I think, in the last 1 year or so, that's what you have seen. And you see, if you look at a continent of 54, 55 countries and an average of 21 shutdowns, this is actually the new norm that I think, unfortunately, we are allowing to be normalized, in the sense that it's just normal, and a standard feature where there's any public order incidents on an electoral cycle. So that trend is something that we really need to watch out for. the internet and the digital space is also considered to be it's the go-to place for any government that wants to clamp down, and largely because of how much people are actually engaging on the internet to exercise and realize their rights to access information, freedom of expression, right to protest, freedom of association. All these rights are now being enjoyed more online than in the offline space. And so for that matter, you actually realize that it has become our digital civic space. And so government wants to our governments are clamping down on that because that space is viewed to be a threat to order, a threat to law and order, a threat to national security. And we're seeing that that rise. So I think I'll stop at that, Bridget, in the interest of the other panelists.
Thanks a lot, Victor. And it's interesting that you mentioned that such digital authoritarianism has become normalized. So to the next speaker, as you highlight what your thoughts are on this topic and the question regarding whether or not we have digital authoritarianism within the African continent, I want you to also reflect on the incidents that have made you think that we have a rise or a decline in digital authoritarianism. So the next speaker at the moment that I'll invite to speak on this is Bridget Andere. Please do share with us what your insights are regarding this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. And yes, again, I fully agree with Victor that the short answer is yes. There is a sharp rise in digital authoritarianism. Of course, this is not a new issue. It's been there for many, many years, but honestly, it's become, as Victor said, an absurdity when something doesn't happen, when there's a protest or elections, or even just generally a conversation on anything, be it legislation or even an incident of corruption, right? So it's becoming more and more normalized for governments to clamp down on free speech, to clamp down on access to information. Arbitrary arrests are becoming more commonplace. And so what we're seeing is that activism, both online and off, is under attack. And to be fair, like if we're being completely honest with ourselves, in the last few years, a lot of people had realized that offline activism was becoming more and more dangerous, right? It was harder to organize in person than it was to organize online. And beyond this, obviously coming out from a pandemic and the restrictions that have been placed on movement, it had become much easier for activism to find its place online. But then authoritarian governments have also realized this and in the same vein have gone after people online more than ever. So Victor mentioned shutdowns, for instance. Every protest, every election, we expect there to be a shutdown. In 2024, there are 27 shutdowns in 17 countries. We have continued to monitor, and it's becoming more and more normal for the continent. People, or rather countries that had never shut down the internet before, are now shutting down the internet more than ever. Countries are becoming repeat offenders. You look at countries like Kenya, which we had always said, was an example in the region. They had never shut down the internet before 2023, and now they've shut down the internet. I think it's 4 times or 5. Mozambique, same thing. 2023 and 2024, they have shut down the internet. Same thing in Mauritius, having shut down the internet in 2024. And so you look at these markers and you realize that there is something deeply wrong. But beyond internet shutdowns, it's also the legislation that is coming up in the region, from cybercrime acts to disinformation laws across the region that impose heavy penalties on people. But beyond even legislation, it's what's happening in our courts, right? Beyond arbitrary arrests, there's also stakeholders that are now filing SLAPP suits. We've seen that happening to multiple journalists who have tried to tell the truth about something that is less than ideal. But even more concerning is what we're calling transnational repression, where the online harms are going offline as well. People are marked online for having certain conversations. They go to certain countries, they're picked up. This has happened especially within the East Africa community a number of times in the last few months, a huge cause for concern. And beyond that, also within the same issue of transnational repression, there's a heightened amount of surveillance now online. You cannot say something without someone noticing. This goes not just for activists, but even for regular people. I'll give you an example. Last year, when there were a lot of protests in Kenya, and even this year, there were people who created specifically for legislation and public participation certain platforms online where people could go read about certain legislation, send emails to parliament to give their feedback, and these people were arrested. Ideally, this should not happen because technically they're only facilitating public participation and access to information, but somehow it becomes an attack on the state and the state then retaliates. So yes, to answer your question, there's a huge insurgence in authoritarianism, and it's a real concern from online spaces, and that is now translating into offline harms.
Thanks, Bridget. You raise very key points, and you've actually outlined quite a number of issues within the African continent. What stood out for me is that you said activism in Africa is under attack. And this is not just activism for representatives within the civil society, but there is also another aspect which I would like Nompilo to talk about. So Nompilo, in the work that you do, I know you work a lot with journalists. It would be interesting to hear how the situation is for journalists within the African continent. So please do outline that for us.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and also the other Bridget and Victor for your earlier contributions. So, I mean, as I was thinking about this conversation, I think one thing that, an idea that a line of thought that I've been thinking about for quite some time is that, you know, this authoritarianism has been there for a very long time. And it's actually thanks to the digital landscape and the global digital community that we are now able to draw attention to some of the repression we've been seeing. And, you know, they might seemingly seem like there is an escalation, but I think it's also because now we have a voice through the online space, and we are sharing more about what we are seeing across the different countries, and we are seeing the patterns and we are seeing the trends. So from a media perspective, something that I would highlight is that quite recently we launched a book, the first ever book on internet shutdowns in Africa. And in my chapter, which was focusing on Zimbabwe, I was looking at you know, internet shutdowns, but also highlighting that it's just another form of censorship, because we've been seeing media censorship across the different years, you know, going back for Zimbabwe, going back even during the colonial era. So this censorship that we are seeing now, this repression that we are seeing now on the digital landscape, we have been seeing it also in various forms on the offline space. You know, towards the media shutdowns, media bombings, towards peaceful protesters, you know, even as Bridget was saying, but also even towards anyone else who attempted to criticize authoritarian regimes over time. So we have been seeing that also happening even on the online space, and also even for the media. But one other new area that I would want to highlight, which we've been seeing, is the aspect of coordinated disinformation campaigns. I mean, growing up over the years, would always hear about propaganda. I think even back then, we didn't even understand what it meant. But now we are seeing it in the form of very coordinated campaigns, disinformation campaigns, where state actors are relying on social media, they are relying on influencers, they are relying on trolls, on bots, on ordinary political parties and supporters to spread false information and discredit independent reporting, to undermine the credibility of journalists, to attack journalists, to harass journalists, and sometimes even with threats of, you know, physical attacks as well. As Bridget was even saying, you know, about how these online attacks also translate to physical attacks. So from a media perspective, I would say we are seeing an escalation in terms of how states have obviously jumped to the queue and are utilizing the online space, you know, to also attack journalists and use new forms like coordinated disinformation campaigns. But the rest of the methods are also methods that we have been seeing. But something that I also want to emphasize, which I agree with Bridget on, was the issue of weaponization of legislation, because we are seeing that also even with, you know, cybercrime laws, that laws that were seemingly meant to safeguard people online are now being used actually to attack journalists and to prosecute journalists. So those are some of the trends that we have been seeing, particularly from a media freedom perspective.
Thank you, Nompilo. And what I'm really seeing from all of these points that are being raised by the facilitators is the similarities in the issues that are occurring across the African continent. When Nompilo was speaking about the transformation or changes in how censorship is now regarded or how it now occurs online, I was just thinking to myself, could this be the old wine in new bottles? Maybe it is. So as we go ahead with our conversation, I know Nompilo just highlighted also an issue on weaponization of legislation, which was also mentioned by Bridget, and also an issue around coordinated disinformation campaigns. And with the advent of AI, a lot of these violations or authoritarianism is going to be occurring. And as we move forward to our next speaker for the day, Ashna, you work a lot with the communities, and I want you to outline to us. I already have an idea that in Uganda, for example, there has been an ongoing shutdown of Facebook. Please do just outline to us what the situation is within Uganda and beyond as well in the communities where you work in, as well as the countries where you operate in.
Thank you, Bridget. Putting my home country on the spot, I would like to disagree with everything that Victor, Nompilo, and Bridget have said. But unfortunately, that's not the case. As the three speakers before me have indicated, there's an escalation, not just a rise in digital authoritarianism. And indeed, in many ways, this is nothing new, i.e., it was happening in the offline space previously. It's just amplified now in the online space because of increased access to information and the ability to amplify abuses online. But the fact remains that for a lot of the African continent, including Uganda, the underlying democratic deficits that exist offline are what are really shaping the online space. Last year's Democracy Index, published by the Economist Intelligence Unit, only categorizes one African country as a full democracy, and that's Mauritius. Other research by Freedom House, CIPESA's annual State of Internet Freedom in Africa report also highlight this regression across the continent. Most of the cases are clear copy and paste. What's happening in Uganda goes on to happen in Kenya, goes on to happen in Tanzania, and goes on across to West as well as Francophone and Lusophone Africa. What's, I think, key to note, and Victor has touched on this, is the sophistication or innovative ways in which this digital authoritarianism is happening. Surveillance and data privacy infringements are on the rise. And the enabling factor here is, of course, the mass rollout of data collection exercises. Here in Uganda, and I'm sure in the countries where we're all from, digital IDs are in place, and these are collecting biometric data. SIM card registration is in force. And we saw a lot of the capabilities around surveillance and data privacy infringements emerging during the disease surveillance as part of the COVID-19 pandemic a couple of years ago. These capabilities remain in place. Governments are actively surveilling citizens using data that's available in these mass data sets, either for SIM card registration or digital ID. Nompilo, from a media perspective, has talked about censorship. The traditional ways in which this was done was merely shut down media outlets. We're still seeing that happening alongside shutting down those outlets if they're online. Most recent example being Jamii in Tanzania. But here in Uganda, in some cases, it's both online and offline censorship. One of the leading private media houses is restricted from covering state events, and that is a new form of censorship. Network disruptions, Bridget has mentioned that as well. These are increasingly happening during protests, during elections, But it's not just access to social media or access to the internet that's being restricted. In Uganda, we've had cases of restrictions to access to mobile money. You can imagine what that means for the economy if individuals are not able to transact. And these are individuals that are not in the traditional banking systems. Also, some of these disruptions have targeted specific applications, very often applications that enable circumvention or secure communications. Repeating again what's already been said, arrests and prosecution of journalists on trumped-up charges. Treason has always been one that's been put forward, especially against political dissidents and activists. But false information is also one that's gaining prominence in terms of prosecution and arrest of democracy actors. Criminalization of speech, that also is on the rise in a guise to fight misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. Many countries on the continent are passing legislation that criminalizes such speech very broadly and very vaguely. And as you can imagine, because of democracy deficits, these new laws are instead weaponized against critics and those with dissenting opinion, less so against harm or real live cases of disinformation or hate speech. Something else that's probably not been mentioned as much by the previous speakers is reduced transparency accountability, especially amongst duty bearers. This transparency and accountability is not just, budget declarations or expenditures related to these digital systems, but also procurement of these systems. In Uganda, there's a famous case a couple of years ago where the government indicated spending a huge amount of money on a machine that was aimed at fighting pornographic content and material. We are not sure whether that machine was ever procured. We're not sure what the capabilities of that machine are. We're not sure when it's used, under whose oversight. And that opaqueness is in itself a form of digital authoritarianism, especially bearing in mind that this is equipment which could, again, be weaponized against critical actors or democracy actors. Data ownership and hosting, that's also a critical issue, especially given that in many of the cases that we're seeing, be it arrests or prosecution of journalists or surveillance, there's often an enabler, i.e. a private sector actor or a telecommunications operator or a service provider that's disclosing user identities or information or cooperating with the state to undertake surveillance. Linked to the legislative environment, for countries that have some sort of legislation in place, it's very often fragmented, and that means that it's either weak or misused, as I gave the example in the cybercrime and disinformation instances. But in many instances, these legislations have also been outpaced by technological advancements. So very few legal frameworks have specific provisions, for instance, around how to handle biometric data. They are, from 10 or so years ago, so they'll just vaguely describe personal information. This makes, obviously, enforcement quite difficult, but also the oversight authorities that are provided for in these various legislation and regulations are in most cases not independent. And that independence can be anything from appointments of the officials in these oversight authorities, whether they were independent from the state, or the resourcing of those entities. So they may not receive budget allocations, for instance, which makes their jobs a lot more difficult. Or if they do receive some funding, comes with strings attached. Last but not least is tech accountability. That's a very fluid field at the moment and is facilitating some of the tactics that the states are employing. So inadequate action from big tech around problematic or harmful content is why we're seeing the rise in laws that criminalize speech. But similarly, for a lot of big tech and service providers, cooperation with governments, they're very unclear and vague around the procedures of disclosure of user information or cooperation, for instance, for surveillance, and whether that's done with or without court orders, etc.
Thanks a lot, Ashna, for those reflections. And just to also highlight some of the issues that have been highlighted, I do know that during the conversation, Bridget highlighted strategic lawsuits against public participation as another key issue that is arising within the African continent. And another issue that was highlighted by Ashna is the procurement of machines for purposes of either addressing disinformation by different governments. We also know that in countries such as Malawi, they also did something similar within this year, actually, at the start of the year, sometime around January. So this is really a concern as many countries are beginning to adopt old strategies as always, as well as bringing in new strategies for digital authoritarianism. And it's interesting also to note that amidst all of these challenges, amidst all of these concerns by us as civil society organizations, communities within the digital rights space, or people that are directly affected by this situation, governments are not heeding to our call, but governments are continuing to not respect the rights that we are supposed to respect. So, for instance, many governments within the African continent are choosing not to adhere to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights declaration on principles of freedom of expression and access to information, which is really a concern because while this is soft law, this is affecting communities broadly within the African continent. And as one government does it, another copies the same. As we move on to this conversation, this conversation, I'd also like our panelists to reflect on the key drivers of these challenges. In your own point of view, what do you think are the key drivers that are making governments continue with restricting freedom of expression, disrespecting human rights online? So at this point, I'll not go to you, Victor, but I will go to Bridget to start us off with this conversation. Over to you, Bridget.
Yeah, thank you. As Ashna was speaking, I was nodding so hard, because I really truly agree with her on corporates and duty bearers. They've become a real big problem because there's no pushback or there's inadequate pushback from them. This means that if a government comes to a telco or to a private company and they say, can you give me this data, they hand it over. That's what is happening. And you'll see with a certain telco, which I will not name before they institute a slap suit against me, is they've given information about people that has led to their arrest and even death. This has happened in Kenya. And so if these companies that host large amounts of personal data about people are not adequately pushing back against governments and ensuring that the checks and balances that are within legislation have actually been followed to the letter, are not doing this enough, then it means we have a really big problem. Beyond that, there's not enough reporting on transparency and transparency and accountability from these same companies. A lot of the time when we see a transparency report come out, it has very little metrics as to government requests, how many were honored, the number of requests, or the manner of requests. A lot of the time you'll just see the number. They'll say we received 10 requests from government and we honored 2. You don't know what the manner of the request was. You don't know how it was made. You don't know whether there was a court order. You don't know in what way they complied. Some will say we partially complied, but you don't know what they gave away, right? And so a lot of the time, the very same people we trust with our information, whether it be for communication purposes or even just on social media to access a social media platform are the very same people that end up putting us in danger. And these companies have a lot of power to push back, because some of them are even the ones who are managing infrastructure for governments. And so they have, the clout to push back, but they're not doing that. And so we need to see a bit more concerted effort from them to, to protect their users and to protect their customers' data that is entrusted to them. At least within the confines of the law. If we do it at the very least within the confines of the law, we get to a really big place, and then we can change the law later to make it even more conversant with human rights. But beyond this, there's a lot of inspiration going on around with countries, and it's the wrong kind of inspiration, because you'll hear something has happened in Mozambique today, and in 3 months' time, in the same situation, it'll happen in Tanzania. That's what's happening around the region and around the world generally. And there's a rise of disregard for human rights, not just in Africa, but even globally. When you look at even the structure of big tech companies and telecommunication companies, a lot of people over the last 2 or 3 years have done away with their human rights arms or human rights staff. And so there's no policy there. And if there is policy, there's a lack of implementation of that policy. So because of that inspiration, where if someone can get away with this, then it means I can too. We're facing a huge problem because people are just borrowing bad ideas from each other on this continent and globally. And then beyond that, there's a lack of check and balance mechanism for a lot of authoritarian governments. You'll find that within the letter of the law, of course, there's maybe a separation of powers or something like that, but then it's a mirage. Because perhaps even if you file a lawsuit against the government, it won't take you anywhere. Nobody is protecting anybody's rights. Nobody is making sure that different arms of the government, whether it's the executive who are giving orders that are not necessarily lawful, you'll find that judiciaries are either backing them up or not saying anything, or you take a matter to court and it lasts 20 years before you ever get a resolution. So there are some good examples, obviously, where that check and balance mechanism does work, but there are a lot more examples where it's just not working. And so because of the situation in which we find ourselves, even when there is law that protects people, where there protection of human rights, robust protections of human rights, because of how they're implemented, because of the lack of implementation, because of the lack of safeguards, even though safeguards are found within the law, they're not being implemented properly, then it's very easy for an authoritarian environment to thrive. It's been fed, and now it's growing far beyond what we can handle.
Bridget has explained it. So there is a lot of lack of transparency by tech companies as well as by governments. There's also lack of implementation of, in cases where countries have laws, some are not implementing those laws. And in some instances, Bridget has indicated that there's also lack of adequate safeguards in different countries. And as we move with our conversation, Victor, you work a lot with you work at Amnesty International, and you speak many times you speak strongly against issues that are not right. So going over to you, what do you think are the drivers that empower authoritarian regimes to accelerate digital repression within the African continent?
Thank you very much, Bridget. I'm going to first allow me to cheekily go back to the first question initially around, like how digital repression looks like. Of course, colleagues talked about disinformation. The one thing that we recently put out a report on Kenya looking at tech facilitated violence against young activists in Kenya. And in fact, one of the findings in that report is how much the Kenyan government actually used, like sponsored trolls to attack activists. And for us, it was such a stark finding. Like how low can a government go to actually hire sort of trolls and troll farms to attack activists? And actually create the fear of or actually sow the seed of fear in activists and anyone to engage, because of course they would engage in doxing. You'd have AI generated images of activists in different forms and shapes, basically trying to suppress them, to try and create that fear that leads to self-censorship. And so it's one of those things that I think increasingly we are going to see governments do, as we have been one of those people who strongly believe that it would appear that African presidents have a WhatsApp group where they exchange some of these very nasty ideas on how to erode human rights. Now, to come to your question on I think what the drivers are, I think one of the major things I've seen, especially in the context of Kenya, where I'm based, has been this security and cybersecurity pretext that has been a key driver. Of course, these regimes are composed of people who have learned the nature and the type of work that we do. And so they did realize that you cannot outrightly just ban free speech or free expression. And so what they have done, and consciously so, has been to rebrand our free speech, our freedoms into national security concerns. And so you look at the case where governments are actually using the genuine need to fight things like cyber crimes, and of course taking advantage of the fact that the population is quite worried about cyber crimes, and using those cybercrime laws to essentially sneak in clauses that clamp down on free speech. And the same applies to terrorism, and classifying everything that we do as terrorism. In fact, it was the Kenyan case post the Gen Z protests that activists on the street were classified as terrorists. And the tag that is attached to a terrorist is one that society does not want to touch. Like, if you have activists charged with terrorism, so definitely their bail and bond terms are quite crazy. It's in there like an average of like $10,000 to just get someone out on bail on bond on a terrorism charge, and that is basically using security or national security concerns as a way to fuel this repression. And I think authoritarian regimes are actually turning to this, and I think we talked about it quite at length in the previous question, are turning cybersecurity laws and cybersecurity laws into repressive tools. So I think that's one driver. The other driver that probably I'll point to is the massive uptake of digitization by African governments. We are in this rush and craze to digitize and modernize our digital economies. I can't think of any African country that is not thinking about harnessing the digital dividend and trying to do everything in digital economy. And so that then means that we are accelerating mobile network penetration. We're accelerating all these things, smart cities. And the problem with this is in how we actually implement it. In terms of, we're trying to get everyone online so that we actually manage to control them online, because a model has been sold from countries far and wide on how a digitized state is easier to control than an offline state. And I think looking at how we have structured our digitization, it's for them to actually utilize that power that digital gives them over controlling people. And I know a lot of governments and a lot of us have made reference to, like most of these technologies used in countries like China, for example. And the model that the Chinese sell in the context that you're told, like controlling a population of I can't quite remember the figure of China, the population in China, but it's of course in the 1-point-something billion people. You need digital tools, and so governments are quickly picking up these tools so that they're able to also ensure that they have a control component in this package of modernization. So I think that is also a key driver that is really pushing this, or basically giving authoritarian regimes power to accelerate these shifts. Thank you. I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Victor. So it's becoming very clear that propaganda is also one of the key drivers, and it's really becoming a norm in the African context. And right here on the call, I'm seeing quite a number of familiar names and unfamiliar names as well. Please do feel free to share your views in the chat. If a particular point is quite exciting for you or not exciting for you, please do mention that on the chat so that we have a conversation, not just with the facilitators, but also engage with you who are here on this call. We do know that you also have ideas and experiences from your communities. So please do feel free to share those, or at any point indicate by raising your hand that you'd like to speak as well. Going forward with the conversation right now, Victor, I really like that you also introduced a new aspect pertaining to TFGBV. We are currently within the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, yet online spaces are fully immersed with TFGBV, a rise of TFGBV that is affecting women and different communities as well. So as we move ahead with our conversation, I would like the facilitators to also reflect on that aspect. Now, going on to Nompilo, you mentioned a lot of arrests of journalists within the continent, and I also do know that we've had arrests in various countries such as Zimbabwe, Tanzania, South Sudan, in different countries really, including countries such as Somalia, Togo. And what I would like to know from you is, what do you think is driving these arrests and what can be done better? By governments as well as civil society. So please do help us reflect on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Bridget Ndlovu, because I wanted to say Bridget Andere has already touched on some of the things that I would have naturally mentioned, which I think are some of the driving factors. I mean, I think for me, it's like law school 101, that one of the key things we would rely on in most of our, if not all of our systems, is the issue of oversight structures. So one of the key things that I have seen, which I continue to see, especially when we think about arrests in the different countries, is the issue of weak oversight structures, which is something that Bridget mentioned as well, in terms of even, that there is no separation of powers anymore. So you'd find that, in most of the countries we've been seeing some of these arrests, you'd find that there've also been accusations that the judiciary is not independent. And you'd find also that the parliament, which should also be exercising oversight over the executive, has been mainly pushing the agenda of its political parties, and in most instances, the ruling party, without necessarily exercising their oversight role. But also when we think about institutions that have been complicit, I know Bridget mentioned corporates as well, but I was thinking also of national human rights institutions. You are talking about GBV, we have national gender commissions in the different countries. We have national human rights commissions in the different countries. And you'd find that most of them have been barely able to bring the government to task for some of the human rights violations or the digital repression that we have been seeing happening. And this has been because of various reasons, budget reasons, that they rely on the governments for their budgets. Some of them are appointed also by the same people that they should be exercising oversight over. So you'd find that we have so many loopholes that have been allowing, especially the executive, to undermine human rights and disregard the existing national and regional standards that we have, in our different countries and within the continent. But also something that I was thinking about was that also, and it's something that Bridget mentioned, that we are seeing, and Victor mentioned it too, that it's like they have a WhatsApp group where they're discussing some of these things. They're copying from the same material. They're, copying these bad practices. But something that I've been thinking about broadly from an advocacy perspective, because, when we have been seeing some of the things happening, especially in countries like Somalia, where, there've been instability and terrorism, or countries in the Sahel region like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, where they have like military regimes, you always think from an advocacy perspective to say, how do I coordinate advocacy in such an environment? And one thing that people have been naturally doing, especially in our sector, is to rely on other governments. Governments that we once claimed or believed to be governments that set democratic standards. But what we have been seeing also is that this repression is not spreading because African governments are uniquely authoritarian, but because the global normative landscape has collapsed. For example, the US has been a standard for so many countries. People in the civil society, human rights defenders have relied on some of these governments, the US included, citing them as, democratic practices that we should follow. They're established Western states. We've been using them as leverage. But that leverage is now gone because in those same countries as well, we are seeing this repression spreading. And you find within our African governments, they're saying, if your so-called powerful democracies are doing it, why shouldn't we? So that's something also that I'm seeing happening quite a lot, globally, and also especially in Africa as well, where it's politically convenient to rely on bad practices that we are seeing in Western democracies. And something that I think has been on my mind for quite some time also is that our African governments are seemingly empowered to do this because citizens have been weakened. We are systematically weakened. If I think about Zimbabwe, for example, we have not had a protest since 2017. People are tired, people are traumatized, people are choosing survival over resistance, people are afraid. We see protests happening in Kenya, in Nigeria, and we emulate that. We're like, oh, at least they can exercise their democratic rights. Other people across other countries within the region cannot do that because, there's no public courage anymore. There's voter apathy. There's little confidence in the institutions that should be protecting the people, the police included. And this is also because of years of intimidation, of arrests, of surveillance. So now we are seeing a people that are fatigued, a people that are afraid, a people that have just decided there's nothing else that is going to happen. So if the same people that give governments power are not able to bring the government to task when they abuse that power, are weakened, then there's not much that we can be able to do. So that's also something that I've just been thinking about, in addition to some of the brilliant, ideas that have been shared already by Victor and Bridget, that, people are weakened, systems are weakened already. And that is why governments are able to do what they're doing and get away with it, because there are very few people that are willing to bring them to task about it. Yeah.
Nompilo, you mentioned weak oversight mechanisms within different countries. You also mentioned lack of separation of powers. And just maybe to also reflect on what you said, I think one of the other biggest challenges is that most of the lack of separation of powers is also made possible by existing laws that are enacted by different governments, making it very difficult for communities to challenge these laws. But because as civil society organizations, this is really our role to challenge such systems. I want to go on to Ashna and say, Ashna, in your view, as we move to the next stage of the conversation, what exactly do you think we can do as civil society organizations, as interested people within the digital rights space? How can we effectively push back against this erosion and digital authoritarianism as well?
Thanks, Bridget. Briefly on the last point, I really wanted to say something that gives a bit of hope, given how dark a lot of the conversation is going, which is the reality. But I think at the center of the drivers is increased adoption of tech and increased access to the internet on the continent, which is democratizing spaces. I think we have to appreciate that as not only a driver of the authoritarianism, but also a driver of the pushback, where all the traditional offline spaces were closing. Tech and the internet are giving voice, they're enabling association and assembly, they're enabling access to information. And that power shift is obviously why we're having this conversation. Is that power with the people or with tech companies or with the state? The other thing with access and still related to power and this repression topic is the digital divide. So even though the adoption is growing and more people are online, those offline are a much bigger constituency. And perhaps in my opinion, this is probably why states are thinking, how do we divide and conquer? How do we control the narratives, control information, control movements? That's probably by restricting the 25% who are online on the continent, so that traditional access to information avenues on radio and television are more easily manipulated. Now, on the strategies and how civil society can more effectively push back, I think a lot of the old age strategies are still effective and valid and should continue to be employed. So research and documentation of trends and developments to inform engagements remains as critical as our campaigns, whether they're online or offline or a combination of both. That's just as important. Policy engagement. So we talked about how many of these countries are passing laws or regulations and legislation and policies that undermine human rights, expression, etc. So engagement in those processes, as we are already doing as civil society, remains very important. These stakeholder perspectives, multiple stakeholder perspectives being incorporated into bills, amendments, strategies, be it on AI, be it on data governance, and a whole host of other digital issues remains critical. And like you pointed out, Bridget, there are frameworks that can support this engagement. So pushing for domestication or compliance with treaty obligations, such as resolutions from the African Commission of Human and People's Rights or the African Union, remains critical. Same with strategic litigation, as well as capacity building to increase awareness and knowledge. Now, the critical point is how we could do all of that a little bit differently. A lot of the conversation here has touched on the shift in terms of the funding landscape and the global narratives. As civil society, we have to be alive to the fact that singing human rights to authoritarian governments is probably a broken record. How can we continue to sing human rights, but in a quote-unquote sexy way? One of those ways is to add elements that have intersections with human rights. The economy is something that every authoritarian government cares about. They want the dollars to keep flowing. So how do we push back against network disruptions without necessarily always focusing on expression and access to information, but what the cost of network disruptions is in terms of GDP figures or impact on economic activity? Secondly is the health sector, right? Digitalization in public services is happening throughout all sectors. But how do we talk about data protection and privacy and link that to access to health or health rights? The other possible interplay that can help advance and increase the strategy of civil society organization is financial services. I talked about restrictions to mobile money earlier as a weapon. But, you know, again, a lot of governments like to hear about financial inclusion and e-services, e-commerce, not least as a mechanism for fighting corruption. So how do we link the digital economy, or how do we link financial service provision to the human rights and digitalization arguments we're talking about? Similarly, when it comes to big tech and pushing for tech accountability, business and human rights is an angle that strategic interventions should focus on, not least focusing on ethical conduct, but also investors, right? That conversation will probably sound a little bit more enticing than human rights for otherwise countries that are authoritarian and not really interested in human rights. Now, the other thing, which again, I think has been talked about, is in all the other interventions, the old age ones that I've mentioned, there's some key areas that could be strengthened. So ensuring that communities of support are strengthened to provide digital resilience to at-risk groups, renewed efforts in that is important. And that can extend from providing infrastructure such as software and hardware through to training of trainers, but also response mechanisms like helplines. Access Now is a very great one, as well as legal aid support. All of these strategies have to take into account social, economic, and cultural factors. So there's no one size fits all. Kenya's context, Uganda's context, different. The challenges for women or manifestations of TFGBV, again, differ. So strategies, as I've outlined above, must be very alive to those local nuances and the different constituencies that we're working with. What that helps with is also to ally with actors that we probably don't very often engage with, actors such as disability rights organizations, environmental justice actors who can join this multi-actor, multi-dimensional strategic pushback against authoritarians.
Thanks a lot, Ashna. And from what you've just said, simply put, what you're saying is we need to completely destroy the box and not think outside the box, but really destroy it completely. You've raised quite pertinent points and ideas of how this can be done better. And as we move towards as we move forward with this, I'd also like to hear from Victor think can be done better and what strategies can be adopted. Ashna already shared quite interesting ideas around how we can better approach advocacy or better approach how we engage with governments by reflecting on things that are more important to them and making sure that our engagements also include the issues that are important to us as well. So in your view, what do you think can be done better? If you're on this call and you'd like to share your ideas as well, please do reflect on those via the chat or also raise your hand as we are approaching the Q&A section. Over to you, Victor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bridget. Yeah, and I'm going to do this as my last thing because I have to go for the travel. I think the one thing that Amnesty has pushed for across the world around this very topic has been the banning of export of some of these technologies to some of our countries and authoritarian states. You know, like we have called and we still call for, the banning of export of facial recognition technologies, export of surveillance technologies to some countries that are known to be abusers of these technologies, and I think the strategy is going for some of these countries that are actually, especially from the pro-democracy countries that export some of these technologies, so that we're able to disrupt that, what you'd call the supply chain or the conveyor belt.
We seem to have lost you, Victor. I hope you're still here. Okay, looks like we've lost Victor for a bit there. And he was still sharing quite interesting insights. But at this point, I would like us to move ahead with the conversation and invite Nompilo to please go ahead and share your ideas as well.
Thank you very much, Bridget. I think for me, I would want to build on something that I think it was Victor that he mentioned earlier around how CSOs are being labeled as terrorists. We have seen that in so many countries where NGO laws are being put together. We have seen that even in Zimbabwe, where the criminal law was amended. You've seen that in Ethiopia, where CSO law was proposed quite recently. And, all these times they use also some of these, standard talk that we want to address money laundering, terrorism. We want to promote national interests and other things. So human rights defenders, CSOs, are being labeled terrorists. They are being accused of implementing donor agendas. They are being accused of promoting narratives that are Western ideas. Government propaganda is painting CSOs as enemies of the state. And so when I was thinking about this, I think for me, I was thinking about it in terms of what we can do differently. And one of the things that has been on my mind quite a lot has been citizen-led advocacy. How can we cultivate citizen-led advocacy? How can we push for that? Because I'm thinking at this point, CSOs cannot be the only voice that is demanding for respect of human rights, for respect of digital rights, for respect of regional and international standards. I'm thinking we need to start cultivating citizen agency and citizen buy-in. I think I don't want to say ordinary people, but maybe for lack of a better term, I can say ordinary people, that they should be able to advocate for access to the internet, to advocate against surveillance, to challenge governments where, they implement laws that have clawback provisions, for example. So I'm thinking, it's high time that CSOs are not the leading voice with regard to some of these issues, but that especially because we have the digital space, we have the tools, we have the capacity to directly engage our governments, our ministers, our parliamentarians on the online platforms. I'm thinking we need to get to a point now where citizens lead the advocacy and lead the conversations and lead the demand for respect for digital rights, because CSOs, as we have seen even through this conversation, they're being targeted, they're being undermined, their credibility is being undermined. So I think we need to also have a shift where now we capacitate the people to be able to lead these conversations and to challenge the digital repression that we are seeing.
Definitely, the civic space is shrinking, and communities will also need to start playing a huge role in advocating for human rights online. And while this is happening, as civil society organizations, we'll definitely need to do a lot of capacity building initiatives as well, so that communities are well informed and resourced in terms of what they can do to help us in this fight. And of course, also reflecting on one of the points that were mentioned by Ashna. Ashna did indicate that there is need for civil society organizations to collaborate with unconventional or non-conventional partners to address specific violations or to address certain issues in the different countries where we operate in. And as we move ahead, Bridget, what exactly do you think would be the best strategy going forward? It would be great to hear from you as well, how you think we can approach this this challenge that is within the African continent. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really good to see that we're very much on the same wavelength with so many of the speakers today, because I keep nodding and thinking, people are speaking my thoughts. It's great to see. But I will say, number one, fully agree with Nompelo. It is paramount that people are informed. For instance, now it doesn't take Access Now saying something, or Paradigm saying something, or CPESA saying something, or IPI saying something for people to say, do not shut down the internet before an election or even during a protest. People are always watching. People know that if there's a disruption, people know what's going on and people know how to document it better. And because of that, shutdowns are on the agenda, and we need to do the same with every other digital rights issue that we're observing at the moment. And so sometimes I think, it's super easy to get lost in speaking to the same people every day, especially people who understand already the work that you do, and other people fall off along the way as you're having a conversation that's perhaps very technical. And so we need to make our work more accessible, make sure the issues are more accessible with their understanding, whether they're policy issues. We need to make sure people understand what the issues are that we're speaking about. For instance, in the last year or so, we've been doing a series at Access Now on that we call TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, on data governance issues. And so we picked a couple of topics that have to do with data governance, and then we were breaking them down over the year, making it a bit more accessible for people to just get the most basic information about those issues, and then for them to do whatever they want with it. And they can come to us with questions as well. So we need to make information more accessible. We need to make our advocacy more accessible. It's not just for the powers that be, it's not just for our peers, it's for the very people whose rights we're advocating for. But beyond that, we need to test the law. We need to test the law and its instruments to its limits. I know it's super easy for us to say also that, because judiciaries perhaps are not doing their work that they're supposed to do, or the judiciary has been captured by the executive, there's no separation of powers. It feels a little bit of a waste of time sometimes to go to court because the court will agree with the authoritarian government. But that's not the only way to do it. You can test the law and its instruments even away from the national context. And even if the national context does not necessarily work, it doesn't mean that we sit on our hands and we decry that the judiciary doesn't work when we can do something about it. For instance, right now in Kenya, just the other day, the Communications Authority action was declared unconstitutional in directing that media houses are not to broadcast live protests. And the reason that they were saying that is because people were seeing people being shot dead on TV, people being arrested arbitrarily on TV. But that has been thrown out by the Constitutional Court. At the minute, there are other people in court fighting internet shutdowns and seeking orders to have them declared illegal in Kenya. The same has happened at ECOWAS level. And so it's on us to keep agitating and keep testing the law. Sometimes even when it comes to data protection issues, I've seen where, especially when it comes to procurement of technology that is harmful and that collects a large amount of data, but that it doesn't have enough safeguards, that technology does not get developed a lot of the time on the region. It's just imported, right? And so we've seen actors going to the countries of origin and filing suits and filing complaints against those companies in their countries of origin, which makes it harder for them to come into the region and do whatever they want because there are less safeguards or they can completely flout the safeguards. And so how can we test the law to its limits and make sure that it works for us? Have the law interpreted, because sometimes they also develop legislation that is very vague. So have that made a bit more clear for people to understand what their rights are, for the courts to have certain declarations on certain things, and then for international instruments also, such as the ACHPR, which has been really great and doing a lot of progressive work in the last few years, the UN, the OHCHR, the Human Rights Commission of the UN. It's on us to make sure that the law is interpreted in a way that works for our context. And so those are the kind of the two things that I would say, in addition to the really great points that have already been made by Ashna and Nompilo.
Thanks a lot, Bridget. And interestingly, you immediately responded to one of the questions that I was going to ask. So when Victor was sharing his insights, he highlighted that there's need to ban export of surveillance technologies to countries that are known to be abusers. And thankfully, you directly responded to one of the questions I had in my mind on how can that be done. So if you're listening in and joining this conversation, now you have it. Bridget just shared with us that civil society organizations and actors in this space can also coordinate and file suits in specific countries where these companies originate from. So this is something that civil society should do, and hopefully people on the call here will take that into account and consider doing that as well. I see we don't have any hands up at the moment, and our chat is very silent, but I do see a couple of names that I can call upon just to hear insights from them. So I hope you'll be the lucky one. If you already think that you're going to be the lucky one, please do feel free to share on the chat or to quickly raise your hand. If not, I will go ahead and call on two names. Hopefully, they'll be responsive. Anthony, I do see you on the call, and Angela, I do see you on the call. If you're interested in sharing your insights, it would really be great to hear from you on your thoughts on this conversation. I'll just give a moment to see if we're having any hands from the audience here. And if not, I'll straight away go ahead to our panelists just to have them share with us one last reflection and what they think should be done. I know they've already reflected on quite a number of points, but just as a concluding point, out of all the conversations that we've had today, of all the points that have been reflected upon today, what's your one key point that you'd like to close us out with? I will give this one to Ashna first, and then move over to Nompilo and then Bridget.
I think we have a hand. I think Yanela's hand is up.
Great, thanks a lot. So before we move on to one concluding point from the facilitators, Yanela, please do share your insights. Over to you.
All right, hi everyone. It's not, it's more of a, yes, it is a question, but as we were kind of having this conversation, especially about rallying people around in terms of knowing their rights and also having them advocate for better regulation when it comes to digital rights. My question is more so focused on, I understand that social media activism or social media can be used as a tool, as a part of activism. But in this case, how do we make sure that in calling people to come and look at these issues and support these issues, that it just doesn't remain on the online platform? I was having this conversation with a friend about how social media is very important when it's assisting activists with awareness, but we also shouldn't diminish the importance of grassroots organizations, of civil society organizations. So in rallying people to come together about digital rights, naturally it's going to happen on a digital space, but has anyone thought about how we facilitate drawing people in from the digital space into supporting grassroots organization in ways that it can drive meaningful change? Because if we don't have face-to-face interactions with whether it be legislators or politicians, then we can't just drive change purely based on social media. So I don't know if perhaps anyone has any thoughts about that.
To our facilitators, thanks a lot, Yanela. Who would like to take that one?
I'm happy to take that one. Yeah, I mean, I think we can use various methods to build capacity in terms of, engaging people. It doesn't have to be restricted to online mobilization. I think we can engage various mechanisms. Just quite recently, here in Bulawayo, where I'm based, we did a training of trainers where we're helping community-based organizations to circumvent internet shutdowns. So we're looking at, what mechanisms they can use, what tools they can use, but also at the time we even spoke about developing advocacy strategies to say, when you anticipate that there might be a shutdown, for example, if there's protest or an election, we know very well that something is going to potentially happen. It's highly likely that something will happen. What can you do as a community-led organization, as a grassroots organization? How can you coordinate advocacy ahead of that incident happening? Or how can you, develop a communication strategy to enable you to continue operating and doing your work as a grassroots organization, even in the event of an internet shutdown? So definitely we can use various strategies, training of trainers being one. But also I remember in my previous role at the Media Institute of Southern Africa, we did a project for like 2 years where we're also looking at, training community-based organizations on internet freedom advocacy. Because one thing that you need to realize also is that this conversation on digital rights is not a conversation that many people are conversant with. You'd find that in so many of our communities, so many people are yet to acclimatize with the conversations on internet freedoms and digital rights, digital repression. So we've done other trainings before where we're particularly looking at internet freedom advocacy. What are the issues that we should be prioritizing? What are the tools that we can use? What are the stakeholders that we can engage, even within our national structures, but also even regional and international mechanisms that we can utilize? So I think it's a case of strategy where you can decide, should it be a social media campaign? Should it be a training of trainers? should it be a resource? CIPESA is well known for developing research material and tools. So it can be even a case of, should it be a guide or a toolkit that can be developed in a local language, to help community or grassroots organizations to lead some of these conversations. So I think there are various mechanisms that we can use depending on the resources and depending on what's available to us, but definitely we should not restrict ourselves to the digital space. That's what I would say. Again, recognizing that, we have the digital divide, like what Ashna said. So some of the people that we should actually be engaging with are in rural and marginalized communities where they cannot even, lead any online campaigns, even if we wanted them to. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Nompilo. Looks like Yanela is satisfied with that response. But if anyone else would like to take that, please do feel free to let me know, Bridget or Ashna. And maybe also just to add to what Nompilo was highlighting, through the work of civil society organizations, we can also capacitate different entities. I do know that within our work as Paradigm Initiative, we've been capacitating lawyers in different countries such as Zambia, Kenya, just so they understand digital rights and inclusion. This is not to assume that all the lawyers have a deep understanding of digital rights and inclusion. So this has really been helpful in making sure that even when we speak of strategic litigation in terms of responding to digital rights and inclusion violations that occur, then this particular community is also fully armed with what they can do and how they can approach the various issues that arise. So Ashna, Bridget, any comments with regard to Yanela's question?
Sorry, I would just add one thing. Again, as Nompilo has mentioned, obviously localization is really important and involving people in the conversation, training people. But another thing I would add is collaboration. Once again, I think a lot of the time it's super easy, especially with grassroots organizations, for them to be left out of conversation. So let's bring them in intentionally. And we do this even with the various fora that we host. I mean, Paradigm hosts DRIF, CIPESA hosts Fifth Africa, Access Now hosts RightsCon. We can bring in more people who are underrepresented in such fora and have them speak to the people who attend these events that otherwise they would not have access to. But then beyond that, another super important thing is to also impart the knowledge of the processes that are outside of the digital space, right? For instance, you'll find that a lot of people don't submit comments for legislation. They don't really participate in the development of legislation. And again, because sometimes governments are a little bit tricky and they don't put that information out there. So again, we can fill that gap and make sure that people have the information when there's a legislation that's being developed and it needs comments. Go out and ensure that people know that this is a process that is happening. Try to kind of intercede and make sure that they have the resources that they need, of course, within our capacity to submit their comments and submit their thoughts when it comes to legislation, and then also make sure that they have the knowledge within the legislation or policy for them to understand the implications and then facilitate their comments and their public participation for as far as we can.
Thanks a lot, Bridget. And any last reflections, Ashna, as we wrap up the conversation?
Yes, so as we've all been talking and sounding like we're reading from a script, I've been reflecting on the fact that we've all mentioned a whole host of other actors and stakeholders that have a role to play in pushing back against authoritarianism, and the fact that those voices are missing here. So as we all go forward and think through on how to engage on these issues and push back, ensuring that we're not always in an echo chamber of civil society organization, Pan-African or international, talking about the doom and gloom is important. The perspectives of tech should be had, the perspectives of the state, even though they're probably going to repeat propaganda, is just as important. Not only is it important to have those voices in such conversations to hear their perspectives, but it's also a form of capacity building. We shouldn't assume that they're aware of these issues or they're aware of the harms that we've all described. So inviting them to such tables is very critical. So that's a reflection point. The second one is earlier when we were describing the drivers and power repeatedly came up, and I talked about the fact that the driver is the recognition of the power of the internet and power of access, hence the pushback. I think that's a key plank we should remain very alive to, and engagement around access and affordability should run in parallel to all these other digital rights, digital democracy issues we've discussed. Cost of access to data is still very high. Local language content is limited. Infrastructure is not reaching far-flung communities. So engaging on those issues remains critical so that more and more come online and are able to leverage online spaces in complementarity with offline ones, of course, to democratize the internet, to democratize governance and exercise their agency. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks a lot, Ashna. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Nompilo and Victor in absentia. This has really been an interesting conversation. I hope you did learn, and all of us here, I hope going forward, will be able to implement some of the ideas and use some of the ideas that were shared by our panelists today. So thanks everyone for joining the call, and I hope you have a lovely day. Cheers and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.